Improving the Culture of Critique, Communicating Across Disciplines. It's a companion talk to a talk I gave last year. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But why is this needed? Why do we need to talk about critique? Why do we need to talk about communicating across disciplines? Both of these things are part of our daily life in game design, but they're often things that we don't really focus on. This is also true often in art school. As both a student and teacher, I often found that we assumed a lot about critique without ever really focusing on it. I'll talk about that in a minute. But when we don't focus on it, and when it goes poorly, as unfortunately it all too often does, our efficiency goes down, morale certainly goes down, and especially when we think about communicating across disciplines, we start to lose good ideas that aren't being communicated, ideas that come from elsewhere, from others, from otherness that we miss. And when we miss good ideas, the quality of our work goes down. So these issues are really important, and they're issues that are certainly very dear to my heart. Before I started working at Harmonix as an artist, I spent about 10 years as a teacher. I taught at the Rhode Island School of Design. I taught at the New York Academy, among other schools. And during that time, and since that time, I've continued teaching in lots of workshops at places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Fisher-Price, Turbine, also at Harmonix. And throughout all of this teaching, one of the things that was always really important to me, and something I loved thinking about, was critique. How do we assess each other's work? How do we talk about each other's work? It seemed to be something that a lot of other art teachers didn't focus on. They tended to have a kind of throw the students in the water and let's see how they swim approach. That's not the case of everyone. There's certainly a lot of art professors and teachers who also think about this a lot, but it was something I really enjoyed thinking about. And it was something that I brought over when I started working at Harmonix. And over the last 8 or 9 years, I've had the real pleasure to first start off as a character artist on Rock Band 3. I was the lead environment artist on Fantasia, Music Evolved, returned to some character work for Rock Band 4, and then back doing environmental stuff with some wonderful musically reactive abstract sculptures in Harmonix Music VR. And more recently, I've been doing some UI work on Sing Space, the karaoke game from Harmonix that'll be coming out really soon. It was being demoed down in the Unity booth. Some of you may have had a chance to try it this week. In addition to that, outside of work, I was a co-founder of a group called Secret Portal. We're really interested in using VR in public spaces and really finding ways for people in physical and virtual worlds to interact with each other. And we've done a number of installations and theatrical performances at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston over the last 3 years. So last year I gave a talk called Maximizing Critique, and that talk really focused on strategies for giving and receiving feedback kind of on individual levels, and really focused on this idea that everyone is responsible in this conversation. If you're giving or receiving, there are ways to make that conversation more valuable. This year I'm kind of expanding from that and having a companion piece to that, which is pulling the camera out a bit and looking at the overall culture of critique, especially how we communicate with disciplines other than our own. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but they're really companion pieces. Was anyone at my talk last year? Oh, great, thanks for coming back. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but not much. I'm really trying to cover a lot of new ground. And if you weren't at the talk last year, you don't need to. Neither is a prerequisite for the other. So let's talk a little bit about communicating across disciplines. We're all in our own disciplines, and here's a kind of variety of them that exist in most game studios. And within that, there's a lot of areas where we overlap, where it's easy for us to communicate. We share common ground. But there's a lot of places where we don't overlap. We may have different languages for describing the same thing. We have different kinds of experiences, different points of view. And that is when it's really hard to communicate. In many ways, it's almost like we're communicating across cultures. And that's when communication can break down. However, it's during those moments that communication is the most important for us to have, because that is when we bring our difference into the conversation, our unique point of view. So ironically, the most difficult conversations are the most important to have. Maybe that's not ironic. Maybe that's just part of life. But in any case, it's certainly the case here. And so now here's a little bit of a review from last year. I'll kind of go over it not too long, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page on a couple things. As a teacher, I used to always ask my students, especially our freshman students, what is a crit? because that's what we call it in art school. We call it a crit. We don't call it and I said, what is a crit? What is this thing short for that we're about to engage on? And many of them didn't know. Many thought it was, well, is it short for criticize? Some thought that. Some thought it was short for critique. And for me, it's a very important distinction between those two words. And it gave us a chance at the very beginning of their semester, at the very beginning of their freshman year, or sometimes in their senior year when this would come up even. What is that difference and why is it important? Well, criticize from my point of view is about more personal preference. It's about being more judgmental. It's about a first response. It's very surface, right? It's very subjective. Whereas critique is much more objective. It's about being more analytical. It's about taking a thing apart, looking at all its parts, finding out how they work together, and then maybe trying to put it back together again. That's critique. And you know what? Critique doesn't even need to be judgmental. You don't even need to be judgmental to have a great critique. If you take something apart and understand how it works, you've served that's a very valuable act. But you can also then be reflective on that process, and in being reflective, start to think, how is this thing working in the ways it can? How is it not being working in ways it should? And then you can start to be not so much judgmental as assessing. How is this thing working? And that's where the judgments come out of, but those judgments are then based on a foundation of knowing the thing on its own terms. That's critique, right? And it's very different than criticism. And as I talk about critique throughout the rest of my talk today, that's the type of activity that I'll be thinking about and referring to. One last thing from last year. We often think of critical conversations as being a kind of one-way street, going from a giver to a receiver. And I think that's very much not the case, but it's a two-way street. Everyone needs to be involved. Everyone is responsible for how that conversation goes. If you're receiving the information, you need to figure out how you're receiving it well and what you can do to improve that information you might be receiving. I covered a lot of that in my talk last year. And if you're giving the information, you also need to be thinking about how is this person receiving it? Am I presenting it in a way that's the best, that will help them understand it most clearly. And so you need to be thinking about how your work will be received. Let me give you a quick example about a time at Harmonix where I wasn't doing that as well, and it became a problem. That was in the early days of Fantasia Music Evolved. We created all of these gray box layouts, which we found a really fast way, just literally using gray boxes, to create them in Engine so we could really be experiencing them with the Connect. And it was great for us, but nobody outside our team could understand what the hell we were showing them. It was completely abstract. We knew it, but they didn't. And so we couldn't get good critical feedback from them because they didn't know what they were looking at. So we had to make sure we brought in a concept artist to do a wonderful draw over on them so that it became clear, and then we could start getting great feedback because people understood what they were looking at. But just a quick example to talk about this idea of thinking from the other person's point of view. How are they going to be receiving your information, and have you given them enough information so that they can understand it in order to give you some good critical feedback? Which brings me to the big theme of not the day. I don't know how the rest of your day has been. The big theme of this hour, and that theme is empathy. You need to be empathic when you, see, this is John, and that's not empathy. That's not it. That's wrong. Empathy is not being overly sympathetic, caring about someone, bleeding heart. Those things are important. We have those sort of a role in our life, but that's not empathy. It's not empathy at all. So that raises, what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to imagine from another point of view. So if you think, John here, he is thinking about this, the person in the painting, in their world, in the world of that person, how would they see other people? What would those other people look like? Trying to see from that point of view. But however, we can't ever really fully do that. When we try to do that, our imagination is blurry, the image we have. Often it's even missing pieces when we try to see something from someone else's point of view. And that's an important part of empathic communication, because when we realize that we're trying to see from another person's point of view and we are failing to do that, there are holes in our image, we are then in an inquisitive mindset, because now we're ready to start asking them questions to fill in those missing holes. That's the core of empathic communication. Trying to imagine and trying to improve that image through the act of engaging with another person. And so in the course of preparing for this talk, I spent some time talking to many of the different departments at Harmonix. And my goal was to find out, how do we feel we are perceived by others? Because often that perception shows some of the some of the ways in which we are misperceived by others, the ways in which we are seen that we don't care to be seen by others, that are actually false, the kinds of ways that are not good to think about when we actually enter into a conversation. So here are a few of those that I found as I talked to people around Harmonix. The artists often felt that people feel it takes us too long to make our work. The designers often felt that they just are creating work for others. They don't feel that way themselves. That's how they feel other people see them in a pejorative way. The producers felt that people think they don't care about quality, that they only care about the deliverable. Programmers felt that sometimes people think they just are there to kill good ideas. QA said, people around us, sometimes we feel that people think that we're just unskilled slackers. People in operations, and in my course of talking to people around Harmonix, at one point I realized, wait a minute, I've been talking to a lot of people who are involved in my initial team, the creative process, but there's a lot of other people at this company that I also involve in critical feedback on different levels. In operations, there's one of them. People in the IT department, people who are admins, they deal with critical feedback all the time. Let me bring them into this conversation also. And they felt that other people often see them as people who do things that are trivial and easy. And the executives often felt that people see them as just giving disruptive directives. They want to just be helpful, but when they say something, people think, oh, it came from an executive. We got to stop everything and just do that. And that's the way in which they feel that they're misrepresented in the way that people see them. Now, so these are the ways that often people feel that they are seen, which probably shows there's some kind of truth in there. Probably means a lot of people do see people that way. And if that is the case, and if we go into a conversation with someone from QA, with a designer, with an executive, and we have this notion in mind, no empathic communication is going to happen. Empathic communication has already failed. We've already failed to have a really productive conversation. But rather, we should start thinking about how people want to be seen. So it was my second question I asked people when I was talking with them. How do you want to be seen by other people? And the artist said, we want to think in terms of aesthetics and experience. And the designer said, well, we are really able to help contextualize our work. These are the ways that people want to be seen. And they're also the things that people from different departments feel they bring their unique perspective to the creative effort. The producers said, we really facilitate process. We want people to see that in us. The programmer said, we want people to realize that we think in terms of systems, and it's a really unique and special way of thinking that is helpful for everyone to understand. QA said, we want people to understand that we actually have a robust understanding of the game across all disciplines. So we're a great resource for everyone to really help understand how things function in lots of different ways. Operations said, we really work to create a better work environment so that everyone can be working more efficiently. And the executives said that we enjoy contributing to the process, and we want people to understand that. We want people to understand we're just contributors. We aren't actually being directive necessarily. Sometimes we have to be directive, and we need to find ways to clarify that, the executives told me. So these are ways that people want to be seen. And if we can go into our conversations thinking that way, how does this person want to be seen, and seeing them in that light, then right away, a lot of the empathic communication is going to take care of itself. Because empathic communication is vital to everything I'm going to talk about over the next hour. It's vital to efficient critical feedback. It's vital to communicating across disciplines. But there is a shortcut. So get this, and then you can, if you leave, no, don't leave. But here's the shortcut that is really helpful. It'll also help kind of go over all the other strategies I'm going to talk about. And that is that, remember, the behavior is shaped by a wish to be respected, be heard, and be valued. One of the things that used to really annoy me and scrape against me when I hear teachers do it when I was a student, or hear of other teachers doing it when I was a teacher in art school, was they would say to the students, okay, we're going to have critique today. You got to leave your ego at the door. And in some contexts, that might work. If it's a context in which that teacher has given those students strategies to effectively leave their egos at the door. But often that's not the case. Often they're just putting the whole onus on the student. And here's why I hated that. And I don't use the word hate lightly. I really disliked that because it put the students in a position where now, we care about our work. Everyone cares about their work. It is hard to hear that your work isn't working well, right? That's the case for everyone. If that makes you feel giddy to hear that your work stinks, then you're some weird exception. But So it hurts, right? That's just the way it is. Now, if you have been told you need to leave the ego at the door, what's going to happen? You hear your work isn't working efficiently, and now you feel bad because your work is failing, but you also feel bad because you're feeling bad, right? Oh, shit, I'm supposed to leave my ego at the door. Everyone else here can do it. The teacher told me I should do it. I shouldn't feel bad, and now I feel bad about feeling bad, and my brain is all in this, and guess what I'm not hearing? I am not hearing the feedback. It's not coming through. It's not being communicated. And so, these things aren't just about being a bleeding heart. Oh, we got to care about people's feelings. We got to think about them, which is true. But that's not the reason for this. The reason for this is if we're not thinking about these things, if we're not validating people and making them feel heard, then they will be unable to hear the really vital feedback that we need to give them. When you do this, you can be harsher in your critique than you can if you don't, than you are able to if you don't. So this isn't about just being nice. It's actually about being harsh in your critiques and rough in your critiques, but having the foundation upon which that can be accepted and understood. So we're going to talk about two different strategies, two different areas of strategy, types of strategies over the rest of the talk. I'm going to divide it into kind of two parts. One part will be things we can do before the conversations that involve critical feedback, and then it'll be about things we can do during the actual conversations themselves. So before the conversations, I'm going to kind of go over three types of strategy areas that we can do before we have these conversations to help lay the groundwork for effective communication. One is we can create inclusive structures. So these are things that can happen more on a structural level within a company. One is we can start to have kickoff meetings as part of our structure whenever we're working together. There was a time when we were working on Fantasia Music Evolved where the concept artists were down the hall, and they were making these amazingly beautiful concept artists, and they were drawings, and they were working with a narrative designer. And at the other end of the hall, those of us who were on the environment team were doing more rapid prototyping of gameplay ideas with the gameplay designers. And we had never talked to each other really clearly at the beginning. So the narrative, actually, let me pause for 1 minute. One thing this example also shows is interdisciplinarity often is within disciplines itself, right? The concept artists, modelers, and technical artists, even within art, there's lots of different disciplines involved, and the same is true, I know, of other departments. But in this case, we had designers, one type of designer down the hall with the narrative and the concept artist, another type of designer down the other end of the hall with us on the environment team, and we were all doing this wonderful work. We were making these great interactive toys, interactive environments that had all these wonderful rules about how you had to interact with them, and the people down the hall were designing all these wonderful, beautiful art things, but we weren't talking to each other clearly. And there started to be a lot of tension, like who is driving this cart here? Are we supposed to be listening to them and driving our gameplay? Are they supposed to be listening to us and doing narratives that overlay the gameplay? And it would be possible to work in parallel, but in this case we really started to diverge and we started to have tension with each other because we'd never had a kickoff meeting. Say, who is responsible for what? How are we going to be doing this? How are we going to be working in parallel successfully? It hadn't been defined, and it created a lot of tension that was unnecessary. And what also would have happened, or would have been helpful for us, would have been if we could have had a regular communication throughout that process. If we would have been meeting regularly to talk about how things were going, so we could kind of stay in the loop with each other's work. And one great way to do that would have been to have regular group critiques. Group critiques are a great way to share work, but they need to be part of the structure. And what's even better is if you can have a structure for the group critique itself. So you're not just throwing people into the water and asking them to swim. What I'm going to share with you now over a couple minutes is a technique that I found incredibly helpful as a teacher. And there might be parts of it you can pull to use in the studio environment. I've used it successfully in the studio environment at Harmonix many times. But it's one way to do critique. The reason I'm presenting this to you is it gives you the example of a way to structure critique. It is by no means the only way. You need to kind of find your way that works best for you and your context. But I just wanted to share with you one so you understand the idea of what it means to structure a critique. And this is a pretty rigid way of doing it, to be frank. This way of structuring critique has two parts. Part one, you got to get to know the damn thing, right? All too often, when we go to critique something, we start talking right away. We feel the need to start judging it or assessing it right away, right? But that doesn't make sense. You don't do that to your friend. You meet someone, and you start, as you're shaking their hand, you say, "Gosh, I really think you're not a very nice person," or "Oh, gosh, you don't judge that person right away. We realize we got to get to know them." The same is true before we give the critical feedback. And here are the steps that I do in this process to get to know it. First, we spend some time just describing it objectively. This water bottle is about 4.5 inches tall. It's about 2 inches in diameter. It's clear plastic. Just the basic objective qualities that are there. What's the purpose of this? It gives us some time to not be judgmental. Not judgmental at all. It buys some time to just be with the damn thing and just look at it and not think about whether we like it or not. We're just with it. Second part, describe your subjective reactions to it. You know, gosh, when I look at this water bottle, it makes me feel a little thirsty, which is good because I can drink out of it. When I look at this water bottle, I think, you know, it makes me feel big because it's smaller than a regular water bottle. It's making me feel big. That's raising these issues of scale. So I'm just starting to describe, and again, non-judgmentally, what's happening inside of me. When I look at this water bottle, it reminds me of the water bottle they used somewhere, you know, sort of in art. That makes more sense, right? When I'm looking at this, it reminds me of an Andy Warhol painting or something, right? What's happening inside my brain? What's happening inside my body? Just describing it objectively. Again, getting to know it on its own terms. What is that thing doing? Before I try to judge it or assess it. Then part 2, analyze it. Begin by analyzing, by finding out what's the goal of this thing. What was it trying to achieve? You know, that might be a larger goal within the art direction or within the gameplay. What's the goal of this thing? Second part, what were the maker's intentions? How was the maker trying to achieve that goal? What were they trying to do with this? And now, you've got all the parts you need. You now have experience. You've taken the thing apart. You spent time with it. You understand how it works on its own terms. And now you have the objective criteria you can use to assess it. And that's the last thing. How does it work to achieve its goals or fall short? Right? Now you can do that. That's, for me, a great process of critique that's worked really well for me for many, many years and has had great success. But one key word here is that word how. Not just is it achieving its goals or is it falling short, how is it falling short? Right? What are the ways it's doing that? Again, it gets an idea of assessing it and really figuring out how it's working on its own terms and by its own system. Final way that we can be inclusive on a structural level in our companies is by brainstorming and bringing people from diverse departments and disciplines in together to brainstorm around a problem to get all of their points of view. If that's part of the structure, things can go really, really well and really efficient, and everyone gets buy-in and feels like they're part of the same, solving the same problem. This worked really well in the Beatles, in the rock band Beatles game, where they had to create all of these wonderful dreamscapes, and so there was all kinds of limitations. So they brought artists and engineers and the designers, and everyone got into a room, and they started to brainstorm solutions, and before long, they came up with a great way that became a really successful solution. But it worked really well because everyone from all the different disciplines was in right away and had a stake in it. They had been involved in making that decision. So we talked about some ways to create inclusive structures that we can do before a conversation, and those are things that often happen to happen on a structural level. But now we're going to spend some time talking about ways we can prepare before the conversation that are more individual. You know, maybe I'm not in a position that I can change the structure of my company, but there are things I can do individually that will help these conversations go well before the conversations even take place. One is by researching ahead of time. This is something that I still continue to this day to work on, which is before I go ask an engineer, hey, guy, I got this problem with the shader graph, can you help me? Spending 10 minutes, half an hour, doing some research on my own, maybe I can find the actual answer and not have to bother him, or at least I now understand the vocabulary that's specifically related. So if he starts talking about, oh, you need to use a dot product there, now I've done some research, I know what a dot product is, I don't have to have him explain that. So I've kind of done some background on myself ahead of time. It's going to help the whole conversation go well. Another is preparing with quick prototypes. This is a prototype I made for the early versions of Harmonix Music VR for the trip sequence that involves kaleidoscopes. I just slammed together some tech we already had just to see how kaleidoscopes felt. We knew it worked. It helped us see that it worked really well before we went into critiquing it, and then we were able to build out the systems we needed to create this more complex kaleidoscopic system that was in the shipping experience. Another way that we can prepare ahead of time is with visualizations. This worked really well as I was working on UI on SingSpace. Initially, I wanted to make sure we had this tablet, which had all kinds of information that you had to read and to choose your songs, to make all kinds of selections. And I wanted to feel like this machine that could, this like wonderful contraption that would open up almost like a Swiss Army knife, could unfold and fold back in. And so I made this paper prototype so I could start showing people really quickly, hey, here's how I want to imagine it working. Here's how I imagine it flipping around. So we had this visualization we could then talk about, which was really helpful, because then it helped the critical feedback go really fast having that. Then, as we continued to work on it, the designer that was working through this with me, Brian Chan, did these wonderful, wonderful just illustrations whenever he was doing the UI design for it, which were just great and helped us talk about it a lot easier. And also made it easier for me when I was scrolling down the design document to find things I wanted to find, because I could see them visually. I'd have to like skim over a bunch of text. And those things ended up resulting in this tablet that we have in SingSpace, which ended up achieving kind of all my goals at the beginning. It's this fun thing to play with in addition to being functional. But that's an objective opinion. That's an objective fact, actually. It's not my opinion. I hope you find it fun to play with. So another thing we can do is we can prepare by defining problems before we go into before we have a critique. And one issue again that came up in SingSpace was we had this HUD, which I had fallen in love with. We wanted to have the HUD as this robot. It would follow you around, and all the song lyrics would be on it, and it was great, interactive. But we realized that it just wasn't working, and so before we had a critique about it, we realized, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve, so we can really focus this. And the problem here was that the HUD needed to be more flexible. It needed to be able to fit in more specific spaces rather than kind of dominating the whole space. And so we were able to, by having that focus and defining the problem, we were able to really quickly start talking about solutions for it during the critique that ended up with this other version of the HUD. It's more like a movie screen or a slide screen that kind of opens and closes around the space. So a third area of things we can do before the conversation are we can do things structurally to help build relationships. And some of these are structural and some are individual. One thing we can do is just share your appreciation or respect for someone. This seems like a little thing, and I almost didn't even put it in this talk. But I have a little thing for this. It's when you see something, say something. Meaning, if somebody did something that you really like, just let them know. There was a time when we were working on Rock Band 4, I was working on the crowd figure assets, and one of the lead designers, Greg Lepicchio, came by and said, actually the creative director, whatever, I think he's the creative director on that project. He said, hey Jeff, I noticed you were working, those character assets are looking really wonderful. I really appreciate, I was really enjoying them the other day. And that meant a lot to me. It was like, wow, first of all, Greg actually was noticing the crowd. That's awesome. And he actually knows what I've been doing. It meant a lot. But later, when we actually had to have a critique about those crowd assets and they actually weren't working as well as we needed, there was a great foundation for that, because I knew that Greg was already coming from this place of actually appreciating them, as now that they actually weren't doing what he needed them to do, it was a lot easier for me to hear that because I knew kind of where it was coming from. So these things are just little things you can do that help build a relationship, so then when you do need to have critical feedback later, you've already got a strong foundation for that to happen. Another is just asking for help. Here's another thing I did recently. You think I would know these things better since I'm talking about it, but I did this recently, a lesson I haven't even fully learned myself, which was I've been working in the animation on this project, and often in Unity, those of you who work in Unity may know this thing where if you reanimate something, if you reparent something or move it around its hierarchy after you've animated it, it's broken. The animation keys don't work anymore. And I've been suffering with that for a long time, complaining about it. But finally, I mentioned it to the designers, or to the engineers on the project, and the lead engineer said, you know what, we've got a tool to fix that. It's been there all the time. I just didn't know. I'd never asked about it. I hadn't reached out across disciplines to say, here's this problem I'm solving. Can you help me do that? So here's why this is important, and here's why it is relevant to this talk. By reaching across disciplines, asking for help, two things can happen. One, you can save a lot of time because things may already exist to help you, right? But two, it's another way to build relationships. By doing that now, by helping each other, we're building stronger relationships. So when we do need to give critical feedback to each other, we're doing it on a stronger foundation. So these are all ways of building relational foundations so that when we do need to give critical feedback, we have a much stronger foundation for it. And the last thing is, we can do organized events. We do a lot of these great at Harmonix. We go bowling together once a year. We have game jams once a year. I'm sure you guys do things like that often in other companies. If you don't, I strongly suggest you do. But here's why I put it in here. I put this here too. I almost took it out also, but I put it in here because I was remembering that often when I go to bowl, I just get so into the bowling and loving it that I'm forgetting, hey, this is also an opportunity for me to be meeting a lot of other people in the company that I don't normally meet and talking to a lot of other people I don't normally talk to. And that's what these things are for. And so when your company does these, really taking full advantage of that and using it as a chance to really build relationships outside of the ones you usually have. So these are the 3 things that are really helpful for doing things before a conversation starts. They're not the things. There are some things that are good examples, and there are many more. It's not an exhaustive list, but some things that I thought would be helpful to talk about today. Now let's pivot a little bit and talk about the second chunk of things, ways of strategies and techniques, and that is things we can do during an actual conversation that's involving critical feedback across disciplines. And the first thing that's helpful to ask here is, what helps conversations go well in general, especially conversations when they're across cultures, right? Well, if we think about it, when people are communicating, if there's someone from China negotiating or having a conversation with someone from the United States or across cultures, what's really helpful in doing that? That's right. It's a moderator, right? Moderators are people who come in and they help to facilitate empathic communication. They do that by helping to focus the critique, helping to clarify the communication. They help to see and they're able to see the conversation from the outside. They have an objective point of view, and they can really then focus on how the communication is happening, right? That's great. But why is that relevant to this talk? Because when we can't bring moderators in to our company just to help everyone talk. Certainly when it's one-on-one talk, one-on-one we can't. And the answer to that is that anyone, anytime, can be a moderator. That's right. You can be the moderator. Even if you're in the conversation, you can be inside of it and outside of it at the same time, acting as a moderator in their own conversation to kind of help facilitate that conversation as it's going on. Let's talk about some ways that we can be moderators of our own conversations. One is by helping to define your own unique perspective. These are some images of Wes, the drummer from Rock Band VR that was made by Sean Witt, this wonderful artist we have at Harmonix. And I love that drawing. I'll look at it more after the talk. But one of the things that Sean was, he was working on this character. He always works on characters. He was able to bring to critiques when people would have critiques about the characters, how they fit into the rest of the game. Sean's able to say, look, as my perspective as the figure artist, I really understand the narrative background of this character. I really understand his psychological makeup. I understand his personality, and therefore I understand that he should have a certain kind of voice when we give him the voice actor for him, or I should understand certain other things because of my point of view. He has that unique point of view that he can bring to this situation. And we can all focus on that. What is your unique perspective? And you can identify it. Don't just start talking before you say, here's the perspective I'm coming from. And sometimes you might be coming from perspectives that aren't your normal one. You might say, as a player, when I'm playing through this game, I find X, Y, and Z to be the case. You can define that perspective that makes your feedback unique. And why is this helpful? Actually, another thing we can do is we can also invite others to do the same thing. So in the course of a critique, say, hey, Brian, as the designer, how do you see this issue? Or Sully, as the engineer, how do you see this issue? So we can invite people from their unique perspective to offer their input and advice. It establishes the value of all points of view, and it really helps to be moderating these conversations in the very act of having the conversation itself. Another way we can act as moderators in the middle of a conversation is through reflection. And that reflection is when we kind of rephrase and reflect back something that someone has said. This is a wonderful painting that Gianna Ruggiero did when we were in the pre-production process for Harmonix Music VR. And it was for where the dance scenes could take place that are part of that experience. And some of the feedback was, it just doesn't look like a very musical place. Now, in Gianna's point of mind, it was a very musical place. You could have musical bushes, you could have musical trees. It was very musical. And so this is where reflection gets to be very helpful, because Gianna could say, well, what I hear you saying is that this place is a place that doesn't have elements that can be musical at all. And that gives then the person she was talking to, the designer, a chance to say, oh, no, that's not what I meant. Okay, you could have musical bushes. What I mean is that we need to find a different place itself, which then gave Gianna the chance to be reflective again. So, oh, what I hear you saying is we need to find a place that something about that place itself is musical, a place we associate with music. Ah, yes, that's right. So you can see that idea of reflecting back, rephrasing and reflecting. In this case, we ended up placing it in a gymnasium, like a high school dance, with a place itself that was a place where we go to enjoy music and dance. So some things to remember about moderating through reflection. First, rephrase, don't just repeat. Second, it's an amazing, excellent way of translating, especially when we're working across disciplines. People who are coming at this from an engineering point of view or from a design point of view, they may be using words that mean something different to them than it mean for us. Because disciplines often speak about the same thing in different ways. And so reflecting is a great way to make sure that we're all on the same page and understanding together. It's also a great way to show that you're listening, right? So suddenly it helps to validate the people you're talking with. They feel listened to, they feel heard. It shows that you care, right? And why is this important? Because it helps others hear you, right? Especially if your feedback is going to be harsh, right? If they're saying something and you're able to reflect back to them, you've understood what they're saying, you really are on the same page with them. I understand what you're saying, but we just can't do that in this case because of X, Y, and Z. And then if you want to be super awesome, you can say, but that was a wonderful idea, and you know what? Why don't you help us figure out the next solution? Let's all work on this together, right? Validate, incorporate, get people involved, make people feel invested, and those are all super helpful things to do. Another thing we can do to moderate when we're in the course of a conversation is we can moderate by asking questions when we're giving feedback. An example of that was we had this new cloth physics that had been designed for the characters I was working on giving hair physics for Rock Band 4. And it was a new system. And the engineer who did it initially had made it so that these top joints there were not constrained. It was different than our old system. And so it wasn't working the way that I was used to working. It wasn't working the way that the old system had. It wasn't working the way I designed all the assets to work with it. And I could have gone to him and said, hey, this is wrong. It's not working, right? But I stopped myself and I said, wait a minute, I'm going to ask him some questions first before I give that feedback. So I said, why did you do that? Why did you design it so that's the default? And he told me, and it actually was an interesting way. Actually, for our next game, maybe we could design the assets to do what he had in mind. But unfortunately, I hadn't designed them that way. So I was able to say, oh, I see that. That's an interesting way. Maybe next time we could do that. Let's do some R&D after this to figure that out. But right now, unfortunately, the assets are designed to have the top joint constrained. So could you please make that the default? And he said, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. And he did it, right? So asking questions before giving feedback is really helpful because you have to assume that our assumptions are false, right? And this was actually something that I also learned from one of the engineers when I was meeting with the engineers. One of our engineers said, Fitzy said during our feedback, he said, when I'm talking to an artist, I just have come to understand that I'm going to be wrong at least 3 times. The first thing I'm going to think is going to be wrong. He just come to understand that his initial assumptions are going to be false, and that's fine. He understands, because we're working across cultures, that the way he's thinking about something isn't the same way the artist is thinking about it. It also saves energy and time by asking questions, because we could suddenly get to the heart of the issue right away. And it certainly saves energy, because imagine if I'd gone to this engineer and said, hey, this system's broken. Now suddenly he's upset. I've got all this anger. We're all angry. There's a lot of energy being wasted, right? So this saves a lot of energy. And it also helps people feel included and valued, like a lot of the other things we're talking about today that gets to the core of empathic communication. But you can also moderate by asking questions when you're receiving feedback. Right? So if you're receiving, and this is a great story for this. This is one of my favorite stories of this talk. Mitch Fletcher is one of the artists that I've worked with for a long time. Amazing, wonderful guy. He was working on Seeing Space with us. He's the environment artist. He'd gotten some feedback from in a bug from someone in QA, and that feedback was the art looks unfinished. And Mitch said, in years past, I would have been I would have been angry, and I would have said, what the frick, does he know what he's talking about? I'm the artist. And he would have, but he said, you know what, I've come to realize there's something there. If that person thinks the art is unfinished, other people are going to think the art is unfinished. And this game is not for artists, this game is for everyone, and that's a good piece of feedback. Now, so I need to start asking him some questions to clarify it. So I can say, wait, I can send back a comment on the bug. Well, what is it about it that feels unfinished? And to kind of try to get more information, right? That bit of feedback, even though it wasn't phrased well, was important because it was like a piece of coal that hadn't been crushed into the diamond, right? There's a diamond in there, some really good feedback that could be really good helpful, but he needed to ask questions to pull that feedback out. And he did, and then he ended up really doing this wonderful redo of this musically reactive art that's up in the sky as we're singing in Sing Space. And so a couple notes about this process of asking questions when you're receiving feedback as a way of moderating. One, just remember that non-artists often find it difficult to talk about art. And that's the case, this talk is in the art track, but hoping everything is kind of relevant for a lot of people who aren't just artists. So you can apply that to whatever discipline you're in. Whatever you are, often find it difficult to talk about whatever you do. But that doesn't mean that they don't have good ideas and opinions about it. And so sometimes you need to ask questions to get to the core of what they're trying to express. So we talked about a number of things that you can helpful to do during the conversation, just a quick review of them, and be participants and moderators at the same time. And some ways to do that are defining your unique perspective and helping other people to define theirs, rephrasing and reflecting ideas back, and making sure to ask questions. Certainly this isn't an exhaustive list, there's a lot more, but I think those start to get at the idea of what things you can do to act as both a moderator and a participant at the same time during a conversation. Before I close, this is one thing that came up as a question a lot when I was presenting this, is sometimes we just disagree. Sometimes, I want an apple and you want an orange, and we're just never gonna agree on that. Right? And so the question was, well, what do we do then? How do these strategies help us to solve that problem, right? Well, one thing that can be helpful is you can find a way within your company to have a structure in place that will help you to deal with that situation when it happens. And earlier in the week, and I can't stress this strongly enough, earlier in the week there was an amazing talk, I think it was on Monday. It was called Managing Conflict on Small Teams. It was by Rebecca Saltzman from Finji, and she went over some of the strategies that they'd used at Finji for dealing with this specific issue when there's conflict. I would strongly suggest you take a look at that. You might find some great ideas for that. But you can also work, the overall thing that's important is having a structure in place, either on your small team or on the larger teams, so when there are complete disagreements, that people will be able to know what to do. It won't be on them to figure out what to do at that point, right? They will have a structure and something that they can do in that moment. But even just using all the stuff I've talked with you about today, focusing on empathic communication, when we get to those points where we just disagree, we can often find that the strategies I've talked about today, we can find ways to disagree with respect and understanding. If I've started to understand your point of view, even though I still disagree with it, I at least understand it, and I can still respect you. We're not going to get into a big fight over it if we use a lot of those strategies and techniques I've talked about today. And in fact, and this next point that I'm about to swipe to comes out of lots of talks with my wife. My wife, Jane Hesser, is an amazing artist, and she is also an amazing therapist. And one of the things that she has taught me is that, the metaphor, the analogy is this: when you break a bone, it's stronger in the place where it heals. And that's true also of emotional relationships. When our emotional relationships break, they are stronger after being healed, right? We can all probably imagine that, having an argument with someone, getting through it, finding it, we're stronger in our relationship having gotten through that, right? And so when we have these moments when we disagree, and we use this, strategies like I've talked about in this talk, or others that you can think of, to find ways to get through those disagreements, then we can not only just not get along, we can actually use it as a way to bond. Our relationships can actually really improve through this process. So in closing, here's just a quick slide that summarizes some of the things I talked about today. I've already reviewed a number of these at each point, so I won't read through them all again. But the most important thing with all of these is to remember that you need to behave with other people's experience in mind in order to give feedback effectively, and especially when we're communicating across disciplines. And you need to do that, you need to focus on empathic communication. And empathic communication is entirely based on the ability to have empathy, and empathy is that ability to try to imagine something from someone else's point of view, recognize that you're unable to do that, that there are holes in your image, and that you need to become inquisitive and try to ask questions and fill in those gaps. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy thinking about this stuff as much as I do. These are, I think, super important things for us to think about as an industry, and I would love to keep this conversation going. Please take down my email, talk to me afterwards, and I would love to find ways to keep this dialogue moving forward and to keep talking about these issues and finding even more ways that we can be incorporating this as an industry. Thank you all very, very much. Great, so I designed this so there'd be plenty of time for questions. And so we've got a good chunk of time. If anyone has questions, you can please just use the microphones that are in the room. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. When you get together with different people, do you ask them to prepare in any way? And I'm asking this because when we have reviews, I often notice that a lot of people come to the meeting and are all busy. They didn't get a chance to review any material beforehand. How do you deal with different people and their different levels of preparedness?
Okay, so we're asking, when people come in to a meeting, how do I make sure that everyone's on the same level? Some people might be more prepared than other people are prepared.
Yeah, how do you avoid doing work in the meeting and having people prepared beforehand?
Oh, having people prepared before the meeting. That's a really good question. I think often in the case with art, and so this may be different for different disciplines, but often in the case of art, if we're dealing with a critical feedback, we want to have a critique about something, that's often not so vital because we come to it, we're going to just, part of the critique itself is to have time to experience it, and that gets us all on the same page with it. But there are times, if that art has very, very specific design constraints, then some people don't understand that, then they're going to be less. So I think the thing I try to do in those cases is before the meeting, this kind of goes into the preparation process, figure out, okay, what are the essential elements that everyone needs to know? If there are design constraints that people need to know, if there's art direction constraints that people need to know, let's just make sure we have that out right away, so that people understand those issues and try to find a succinct way of telling what those issues are. And that works, I found that work really well in an art context. In a non-art context, I can't speak to. Are you an artist or are you?
I do a lot of different things.
Okay.
It's different expertises, so it's indeed different for different areas.
So I imagine it would be very different. And that's one of the reasons I would love to start expanding this conversation out to non-artists, so we can start talking about some of the strategies that are helpful in other disciplines for doing these kinds of things. Because I would imagine that in an engineering meeting, that is the level of preparedness people need to have is much greater coming into the meeting. But I can't speak to that because I don't have that experience.
Yeah, no, but that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. And that also reminds me of one little thing that, I had all my bubbles of the different departments. My bubble for engineering, initially it said coders. And in the course of my meeting with them, I said, oh, wait a minute, you guys, I've been meaning to ask you for a long time. Do you guys like being called coders? And I found out that a lot of them don't. A lot of them think it's like calling you a pixel pusher. I said, well, yeah. And so I said, well, and so I found out, what do you like to be called? And so I changed it to programmers here. But and it wasn't the case. Some of them thought coders are fine. Well, but some of them some didn't like it. Yeah.
Hi. So as you know, especially working on a big team, this is a journey, and the journey is sometimes fraught with pitfalls. And I think sometimes I've encountered situations where there is a loss of respect, and then therefore like a loss of trust. Yeah. And with that comes baggage, especially if the dev cycle is long. Yeah. And so I guess from your point of view, from your past experience, what has been the best way to resolve these more like ingrained and deep-seated issues that have taken a while to kind of like form that ball?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, what can we do when over a course of the time, people haven't been paying attention to a lot of these issues, and therefore things have festered, and now people have lost respect for each other. And how can you repair that once it's happened? That's a great question. I mean, there's the easy answer and there's the hard answer. The easy answer is to kind of negate the foundation of your question and say, well, the best thing to do is to start making sure you have a culture in your company of doing these types of things early on so things don't fester and get to that point, right? So that's the easy answer, but that kind of doesn't help you in your question at all, right? Because you might be dealing with this in a specific case right now. And I think that the best way to do that is, gosh, I don't know, I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head now, but if I were in that situation, I would try to find a way to get as many people on the team to recognize what's happened as possible, to be transparent about it. So look, we have developed a problem here. We're not communicating well. Try not to personalize it. If it's just one person or another, don't personalize it. Don't say, hey, you've really gotten to be angry here and we don't like your anger, right? That's not going to be helpful, right? So try to find ways, we aren't communicating as well as we can. And acknowledge that the structure has been the problem. Blame the structure, right? Say, we've had a really horrible structure for the first half of this project. There are a lot of things we haven't done that we should have done. And that was a mistake. Right? And what we need to start doing now is finding some ways that we can fix that. Because we aren't trusting, just list what's happening. We find that we're not trusting each other anymore. List that out, acknowledge that it's happening, blame the structure for it, and then say, bring everyone in. So don't say, okay, and here's what we're gonna do to solve it, right? Say, okay, as a group, we need to start figuring out how we're going to solve these problems. Let's all start thinking of ideas for this. And then maybe some of the ideas in this talk can be things that can get that conversation going, but the conversation itself should be a participatory process. So everyone's invested. And once everyone's invested, there's going to be a lot greater chance, if it was their idea, right, there's going to be a lot better chance that they will do it going forward. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Hi.
This is kind of in a similar thought process of, is there anything you guys do specifically to educate, like team-wide, how to implement these techniques and have an effective conversation, and or anything you do team-wide to help establish that process and structure, whether it's like just having a mini workshop on site or things like that? Is there anything specifically you guys implement to educate the team?
That's a great question. The question is like, what can we do on site? What are some things we can do to implement this and to kind of get it, ways that we can make sure everyone's on the same page with these ideas. Last year, a couple things. One, Harmonix has periodically brought in outside consultants to run workshops with lots of people around the company about facilitating communication, and that's been super helpful. Another thing, last year after my previous GDC talk on maximizing critique, after that, I gave the talk to the whole company, so that's another way of kind of making sure we're all on the same page with that. And then in the process leading up to this, and this has been a little bit more just kind of individually motivated on my part, but I've actually been going around and getting feedback and getting input from all the departments, which has really been helpful in kind of already starting some of these conversations. And I don't want to say that these conversations, a lot of them were already happening, right? And it wasn't that I started these conversations at Harmonix at all, but as I started talking to the different departments about it, it helped to bring those conversations out and help other people start talking about it more. So that's been really helpful. And in fact, I think that talking to individual departments has in many ways been as or more valuable than talking to the company as a whole, because we can have these nice little individual conversations. So some combination of that. Is that helpful? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. You talked about for certain things where people just disagree and it's not a matter of miscommunication, they're just kind of butting heads against fundamentally different things. And you mentioned processes for dealing with that situation.
Yes.
What are some examples of that?
One, which if you have access to the vault, that talk I mentioned from last Monday, and I'm not going to, Rebecca Saltzman's talk was amazing, and she gave some great ideas for that they use really well. So I would really suggest you, that's a kind of a whole big other topic, and I think I can't recommend highly enough that you watch that. I was blown away by her talk on Monday.
Rebecca
Saltzman.
Okay,
S-A-L-T-S-M-A-N.
Okay, thanks.
And yeah, it was on Monday. And I can give you more reference to that when you you come back up there. Any other questions? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I actually am an assistant producer and I do a lot of feedback gathering for artists, but I do it across multiple different offices. So we'll do Chicago, France, Russia, and here in San Francisco. The biggest issue I have is getting all these people from all these different offices on the same page regarding what they want to go in the general direction for the artist without inundating the artist with a million different ideas and concepting, 16 different things.
Yeah.
Do you have any great suggestions on trying to get all these different people in all these different time zones on the same page?
Oh, that's a tricky one. So yes, we did, at Harmonix, we've been doing, a lot of people have been working remotely and we can all kind of talk. We use Skype a lot, which has been super helpful, but we're not working that remotely. We're kind of, some of our people are like 3 hours apart, we're kind of spread across the United States. And so we're still able to kind of be with each other at least once a day. It sounds like the struggle you're having is people are like, globally, like people?
Yeah, we usually do global conversations via Skype to try and capture all these things, all the ideas and stuff like that, but it's always, the hardest part is getting the very first foundation and then building up from there. And we try not to get the artist involved because we tried doing that initially, and it just became 16, 17 different concepts that took weeks on end to do. And we're trying to not have them do that.
So you're trying to figure out, like trying to define what the initial goals are,
right,
that then you can disseminate to evereverone else?
Right.
And who is involved in that initial conversation of defining what those
usually it's our marketing, production, high tier, usually.
Okay, and what would some of those kinds of things be? What would be the product that that team would be figuring out?
Usually these are like key art. So I work on World of Tanks for console, and we do like splash screens for when you load into the game. We do news article, things like that. We'll try to use the art in multiple different ways.
Yeah.
Things like that.
That's a tricky one. There's certainly, so the issue is like a lot of the key art and things that need to be done for marketing, how can that be integrated as part of the team development?
Right.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It'd be, because it often needs to happen independently, but the stuff you're doing is really how this team who's been so invested in the work that they've done, this is how the world is going to see their work. And unfortunately, often, the way the world's going to initially see their work isn't the way they want the world to see their work after being invested in it. Exactly. And a lot of tension can be created there. And I just, if there's some way, and I see to find a way to make people feel engaged and part of that process without then what you said, like having all these different concepts involved. I think that maybe it's a question of having something you've done and then opening up for feedback on it in a very constrained, like not open feedback, but saying, here's what we have and we need some feedback on you. Here are the things we are concerned about. So people, but that is an issue that I think happens in a lot of companies, and it's just something that is something to really work on, because I think people, a lot of those artists and people who have spent so much of their time on the work and then feel that the way it's being publicized is out of sync with all the work they've done, that can really create a lot of morale issues. And so I think that finding ways, either from the beginning or toward the end, to incorporate the feedback of the artists, and not in a way that like asks them to do the work themselves, because that could also, but in a way that like somehow asks their feedback so they feel as though they're part of the process, I think is really important. And
like a preemptive meeting with the artists themselves away from the others.
Perhaps. Every company would need to do it different ways, and different companies are different sizes. And so I don't know the specific strategy that'd be great for your company, but the goal, what I do understand is the goal, I think, would be great. And the goal would be to help everyone, as many people as possible, feel invested and involved. And that would be the goal. So I'm not sure the specific strategy would be helpful. But often having the goal is the key, because the strategies often end up falling out from that goal, right? So like even that answer, the question I didn't answer so well a moment ago, like what do you do when people really just disagree, right? Well, what's your goal for that, right? Our goal is to come up with a strategy that works in our company that all agree on, that when we disagree, here are the steps we're gonna follow, right? And so that's the goal, and I think every company can start to find its own way to implement that. So I kind of answered both questions at once there. But did I answer your question? Did I give you this?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So in our team professionally, when we're discussing our own work, we tend to try to implement these processes, but we backslide a lot during social hour. So specifically, like if we're playing games together, people can just get really like brutal and want to double down on like, oh, well, why would they have made that art decision? Like that's shitty and that looks like crap. And having that ends up creating backslide during our own critiques. Do you have strategies for discouraging that kind of behavior when it's not in a specific work situation, but it's affecting work?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Because we can't, it's a great question. So the question, as I understand it, is, it's one thing to make sure you can have a structures and language at work that everyone kind of follows to stay on the same page, but often outside of work, people start to use really derogatory or insulting or harsh language about things that then starts to leach back into the relationships at work. Is that?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of gets just kind of back to the larger cultural thing. You can't tell people what to do outside of work, of course, but what you can as a company start to really encourage is, hey, these are efficient ways to work, but they're also great in our regular life. I think if these ideas are presented in that way, like, hey, you might find that this stuff is not just helpful for you at work, but it's also helpful for you outside of work. You just suggest that is a way to kind of encourage people that this is not just a culture here, but it's a culture to behave in life that's helpful. And then also, even outside of work, catching that. If people are talking that way, standing up and saying, hey, that's really not helpful when we talk about it that way. And I think if individuals can take that on themselves to realize that, it's like a lot of other, kind of touches on a lot of other issues going on now, right? Like when stuff's going on in society and you see people behaving in some horrible, horrible ways, is it, can you just ignore it, or is it your responsibility to kind of say, hey, that's not awesome? And this is what you're saying is not nearly as bad as what's going on outside this room, but if you find ways to take it, even outside of work, if you see that happening, say, hey, that's not really helpful when we talk about it that way, even here. Or you can or instead of judging it, you can just turn it and say, well, what was one of the examples you said that they would say like that?
So if you're like if we're playing games together at lunch, that somebody might start like bragging on the art style.
Yeah, like, well, the art style goes, that style book really sucks, or really, then you can say, well, what is it about it that you don't like? Just instead of telling them they've done something wrong, you can encourage them to rephrase it. Like, oh, what is it about it that you don't like? And if they continue to use, just start kind of pulling from them until you've pulled out from them helpful language about it. Even if it's not impacting you, you can just be using, what you're doing then is you're starting to give them a moment to learn how to rephrase things that are helpful. And if you just kind of start doing that all the time, other people might start doing it too, and then people start to really learn better ways of speaking. That's one strategy, but it's a tricky situation. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, that's our last question. I'm going to be up here as long as I can, and then I'll also be in the hall, but depending on how many people it is, if anybody wants to stay, I will stay as long as anybody wants to talk about anything, so we may end up in the wrap-up room around the corner. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks for staying.